Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is a love story between two seemingly vastly different individuals whose connection ends up saving a planet and each other. But the things that play out in the story also have some pretty significant Cosmere implications. So if you were confused about what's happening in the story with machines and spirits and splinters of virtuosity, then this is the video for you. This video will include spoilers for Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, but not much else in the Cosmere. I do reference a magic system that takes place in Warbreaker and a line in Isles of the Emberdark, but I'm not spoiling anything in those two books. So with that, let's get into it. Okay, so from a Cosmere perspective, my point in this video is that Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is fundamentally a story about freeing the Splinters of Virtuosity from their captivity in order to fulfill some sort of broader purpose that the Shard of Virtuosity may have had. There's a lot to break down here, but for the purposes of this video, I want to start by first explaining what the Splinters of Virtuosity even are, how they were inadvertently imprisoned, and what Yumi did to free them from their captivity. I'll then transition to talking about what that means for the Cosmere. Okay, so what are Virtuosity Splinters? Virtuosity is a shard. She was one of the 16 that Adonalsium, that's like the one god of the Cosmere, was shattered into thousands of years ago. And there's a lot that we don't know about the person that held that shard of virtuosity. We do know that she was a female, an unnamed female, and that at some point she herself splintered herself up into thousands of different splinters, essentially killing the shard as it stood. Yumi knows of these splinters as primal spirits, or Hijo or Hio. And they're somewhat over time, because of the investiture that's nested in them when it was a shard, they've grown somewhat self-aware, which is consistent with the way that we see other splinters or shards kind of interact in other magic systems as well. Those splinters or those spirits are linked to Virtuosity's original intent, i.e. they're drawn to virtuosos. People that have this creative expression or artistic expression at this really high level. And in Yumi's case, that is in the context of her stacking rocks. Over time, what humans have learned is that you can attract those splinters or the spirits to you by performing an act of virtuosity. And once you do that, you can bind those spirits by requesting that they transform into something that's useful, like a light or for transportation. And that's what we see people in Yumi's world repeatedly do. They draw those spirits through Yumi's kind of act of virtuosity, and then she binds them for some purpose. And that brings us to what actually made them captive. So about 1700 years before the events of Yumi, those splinters were bound semi-permanently or permanently by a machine that was created specifically to harness their power or their investiture as effectively as possible. Let's talk about the mechanics of how that happened. So, about 1700 years, the people of Kamashi, that's the planet that Yumi is set on, created an awakened machine, which they unveiled and they activated during a festival in a town called Torio. Their intent was noble. They were seeking to channel and unleash the spirit's power for a source of energy in order to propel kind of technological growth in that city. And so to awaken the machine, that's awaken with a capital A, they gave the machine a command. We don't know exactly the command that they gave, but one of the scholars explains that it was something along the lines of for the machine to, 1, protect itself, and then 2, is to harvest energy from the spirits. So I'm guessing that the command was along those lines. For context, we've seen awakening before. We saw it in Warbreaker, the novel Warbreaker, which is essentially the ability to turn like an inanimate object into something a little bit more sentient by giving it that command. And the most notable example of awakening that I think that we've seen to date in the Cosmere is the creation of Nightblood. That's a sword that was given the command to destroy evil and is essentially turned semi-sentient, if not entirely sentient. But awakening this machine had some pretty terrible unintended consequences, both for the people that created the machine and for the Splinters of Virtuosity themselves. For the people, it killed them. What the machine ended up doing is that it drew on the investiture in all of the people's souls around it in order to harvest that energy as well, and in doing so, it killed them. And I think that's because Virtuosity was splintered in that region, and a piece of her investiture had kind of like lodged itself in the resident's soul that the machine then drew on. The refuse from that dead soul created what's known as the shroud on Kamashi. So it's basically this ever-present darkness that is comprised of the dead people's souls. The machine also fed on the spirits as commanded. It harvested that power, that investiture from Virtuosity's splinters in order to create what are known as these high-on lines. That is, these kind of bands of energy or investiture. One is magenta and one is cyan, so one is pink and one is blue. Eventually drawing all of Virtuosity's splinters to it in order to charge these high-on lines. There's only two groups of humans that survived this like really gory fate. That's refugees kind of like at the edge of civilization on the planet, and then the Yokihio. So the refugees were, as I said, like kind of on the edge of civilization, so they escaped the original activation of the machine. And eventually, they found the high-on lines that the machine had created, and they tapped into them for that planet's electricity. And so all the descendants of Kilahito, so the main city on the planet, are descendants from those refugees that were able to tap into that electricity or investiture for the workings of their city. The other group of people that escaped were the Yokihio. That's Yumi and 13 others. Because they were so highly invested, they died like everyone else, but they were resurrected into what in the Cosmere are known as cognitive shadows. And the machine wasn't really able to control them, so in order to protect itself as commanded, it created kind of these fake worlds to keep them placid. And it did so by erasing like 1 day of memory from each of the Yokihio, so they were living the same day over and over again in like the Cosmere's version of Groundhog Day. And that's how it stayed for almost 2,000 years. So how did Yumi break this? And it came down to virtuosity. It's because Yumi's skill at stacking rocks had grown so deep that her skill actually overcame the binding of the machine and pulled one single splinter to her instead. And that splinter wasn't able to do a whole lot, but what it was able to do was, one, clue in Yumi to this idea that something is deeply wrong here, and then two, it bound her to the soul of someone more real, and that's Painter. In binding her soul, what it meant is that the machine couldn't erase her memories in the way that it had been doing. And so with that gift, the gift of being able to have her own memories, Yumi was able to basically like figure what was going on here. She defeated the machine in the same way that she had pulled that original splinter away, essentially by stacking rocks to a really high level, so she was able to pull more and more splinters away from the machine towards her, depriving the machine of the investiture from those splinters or those spirits. And that's what leads us to the climax, where she frees the Splinters of Virtuosity and enables that kind of shroud to melt away and undoes the work of the machine that it's been doing for like the last 2,000 years. But that leads us to kind of the big point here, which is, what does all of this mean? Like, who cares that the Splinters of Virtuosity were released from the binding of the machine? What does it mean for the Cosmere? Like, why should somebody on another planet care? And this is where I'm going to start speculating because I have a couple of theories around this. One big one is that Virtuosity never actually fully died, and she actually planned to gather up her remaining splinters and reform in some way. I know there's a popular theory out there that the Irreali are products of Virtuosity, and when they talk about the one being reconstituted, that's a reference to Virtuosity reforming. I think this theory might be strengthened by one line in Isles of the Emberdark. And in it, one of the characters, Ed, who's like an arcanist, so knows a lot about like Cosmere lore, he is trying to figure out which shard may be involved in like a completely unrelated event that's happening in that book. And what he says is, it might be some remnant of ambition, and no one knows where Virtuosity is these days. Hell, it could have been Dominion or any number of other shards that can no longer explain what they did. And I found this line really interesting because what it's suggesting is that Virtuosity isn't one of the shards that can no longer explain what they did, i.e., one of the shards that's died or been killed in some way. In fact, what it's suggesting is Virtuosity is actually hidden. And so I think it points to the fact that she never fully died, and actually by the time the Isles of the Emberdark takes place, she may actually have gathered her splinters up and reformed in some way. I feel like I haven't fully unpacked my second theory on it, so I'd love kind of thoughts on in the comments below. But it kind of centers around this idea that the splinters or the Hyon lines naturally separated into two lines, one magenta and one cyan. So one pink and one blue. And I think there's some sort of like yin and yang playing out here. Given that Yumi is a love story, like kind of about a man and a woman, could it suggest that Virtuosity splintered herself up into two essential subparts, one yin and one yang, maybe in order to like create baby virtuosities, like maybe in order to magnify her power and create more shards out of that investiture? I'm still working through this, as I said, but I also don't think it's a coincidence that all of the events in Yumi are set in a dual planetary system. That's the planet of Kamashi and another planet that they discover known as Utol. And so I do think there's some sort of like duality playing out here within the planetary system, within the way that the investiture, Virtuosity's investiture is separating, which could suggest some purposeful play by Virtuosity to multiply her shards, to magnify that investiture. Which I think could like have pretty significant implications for the balance of power in the Cosmere among those 16 shards. But tell me what you think in the comments below. Yumi is such a cool story, and so I'd love to know if there's anything here from a Cosmere perspective that I missed. And if you like this kind of content, please like the video and please subscribe to All Things Cosmere. Thanks, everyone.